The tray was heavier than she had anticipated. Cecily had carried trays in her own household, but those had been lighter things, a pot of chocolate and 2 cups for herself and her father on winter mornings, and nothing like this arrangement of candlesticks and snuffer, and a pitcher of water that sloshed against her wrist as she moved through the corridor at Thornfield Park. The gray wool dress was a size too broad at the shoulders, and the mob cap sat slightly forward on her dark hair. And neither of these facts was visible to the 14 guests assembled in Lord Pemberton's drawing room, which was the only thing that mattered. She had been a maid for 4 hours. She was, she thought, managing tolerably well. The drawing room was candle-lit and generous, a fire burning at each end, silk-covered chairs arranged in careful groupings, and the assembled guests of Lord Pemberton's 3-day autumn party moving among them in their satins and their tailcoats, and their easy assumption that every woman in grey wool was there to serve. Cecily moved along the far wall. She set a candlestick on the side table by the tall window, adjusted the snuffer, kept her eyes lowered as Nell had instructed her. Then a voice said, from somewhere to her left, quiet and level, and carrying an authority she felt in her spine before she understood it, "Bring the candelabrum nearer, the one on the chimney-piece." She turned. "Tur." He was standing at the writing table in the alcove, papers spread before him, not looking at her, his attention on something in his hand. He was tall, the tallest man in the room by a measure, broad through the shoulders in his navy tailcoat, dark complexion visible against the white of his cravat. The candlelight caught the line of his jaw. He still had not looked at her. She crossed the room. She lifted the candelabrum from the chimney-piece, brought it to the writing table, set it precisely where the light would fall on the papers. He moved them slightly, still without looking up. Then he did look up. His eyes were dark and very direct. They moved over her face the way eyes move over a face that contains no information of interest. And then he returned to the papers. "Thank you," he said, his voice low. Cecily turned and walked back toward the far wall. Her heart was going too fast, and she told it, silently, to stop. Under the apron, against her sternum, her father's signet ring shifted on its ribbon with each step. She had worn it there for 11 months, since the morning after the funeral, when she had found it on the dressing table where he had left it the night before he died. She wore it now as she had worn it every day since, close, hidden, and waiting. The man at the writing table was James Wentworth, Viscount Hallerton. She had known his name before she entered this house. She was not here for him. She was here for the man across the room, standing at Lady Maud Fenwick's elbow, nodding at something the older woman was saying with the easy manner of a man who has been trusted for 15 years and intends to remain so. His name was Aldous Fenwick, and he had administered the Ashmore estate since before Cecily was old enough to understand what an estate was. And 3 weeks ago she had found the first proof that he was selling her father's private correspondence to people who wished to destroy what remained of the Ashmore name. Sir Edmund Ashmore had been dead for 11 months and 3 days. He had died quietly, in his study, with a book open on the desk and a letter in his hand that the family had never recovered. The whispers had begun before he was buried. A baronet with connections to the wrong political faction, the gossip said. Letters that proved it. A man whose private views, once aired, had embarrassed certain persons of rank who did not wish to be embarrassed. The season had moved on, as the season does, carrying the judgment of a ruined name the way a river carries a stone downstream, smoothly and without looking back. His daughter was not so easily moved. Cecily had not believed it. She had grown up watching her father at his desk, watching the careful deliberateness with which he composed his thoughts, the principled quietness of his convictions. He was the kind of man who argued by demonstration, who offered an example where another man might offer a declaration, who looked at each question as if the question itself had feelings and deserved to be treated with respect. She knew his character as well as she knew her own face, and the man the whispers described was not her father. She had spent the first 6 months of her grief in the necessary machinery of grief, the letters, the creditors, the entail, the slow and humbling process of learning the precise dimensions of what had been left behind and what had not. Her father had not been careless with money. But he had not been lucky with it either, and the estate was smaller than it appeared from outside, and the debts were larger. She had a small allowance from a distant cousin who had inherited the property and felt no particular obligation but a moderate guilt, and she had Nell, and she had the house in Bath where she and her father had spent the last 2 winters, which was now her house, insofar as she owned anything at all. She was not to the season a figure of great interest. A baronet's daughter with no fortune and a ruined father's name sat in a category the season had organized long before she arrived in it, and the category was not worth the trouble. 3 weeks ago, sorting through correspondence that Aldous Fenwick had been meant to organize and had not, she had found a copy of a letter her father had sent to a friend in Parliament. A letter about an entirely unrelated matter, with 2 paragraphs removed at the beginning and the end. The letter in its original form was a discussion of agricultural reform in the western counties. Mire! What remained of it, standing alone on the page without its opening and its close, looked like a political declaration it had never been intended to be. It was a skilled piece of surgery. It had been done with knowledge and precision by someone who understood the original documents well enough to know exactly which parts lifted out would serve the purpose of those who wished to paint Sir Edmund Ashmore as a man whose private convictions had been dangerous to his friends. She had sat with the letter for a long time before she understood what it meant. She had sat with it at the desk in the small room in Bath, in the chair her father used to sit in when he came to visit her, the one with the worn cushion at the back that he had always meant to replace. And she had understood it the way you understand something that you have been turning over for months without knowing exactly what it was you were turning. Only Fenwick had had that access. Only Fenwick had had that understanding. He had administered the Ashmore estate since before Cecily was old enough to understand what an estate was. He had organized the correspondence, managed the legal affairs, attended her father's desk with the quiet competence of a man who had been trusted so long he had ceased to be examined. He had been at the funeral. He had pressed her hand and offered his condolences and stayed for the cold supper afterward, and eaten well. She had not gone to a magistrate. She had nothing beyond a copy that she herself had found in circumstances that were themselves irregular in the house of a dead man, whose debts made his daughter's word worth very little. A copy she had made herself, in her own hand, attesting to nothing except what she had found and what she had noticed. What she had needed was proof of the transaction itself. What she had needed was to see the letters change hands, to identify the buyer, to establish that Fenwick had been receiving money for access to her father's private correspondence since before the funeral, that the alteration and the sale were connected and deliberate and had a paymaster behind them. Lord Pemberton's autumn house party was the occasion. Fenwick was a guest, and he had connections enough to receive Lord Pemberton's hospitality, having managed the affairs of 2 or 3 good families in the county, and acquired thereby a social standing that appeared solid, so long as no one investigated the foundations. Lady Maud Fenwick, his patron and distant relation by marriage, was the moving force. She moved through the season with the assurance of a woman who has not been refused anything in 20 years, and has organized her world accordingly. Nell, Cecily's own housemate since childhood, had agreed to the exchange with the uncomplicated loyalty of someone who had watched a good man's reputation dismantled by a process she could not name, but had no difficulty recognizing. "You shall need to practice looking through people," Nell had said, while Cecily pulled on the gray dress in the small room at the inn, a quarter-mile from Thornfield Park. "Not at them, through them, as if they are slightly interesting furniture." Cecily had practiced this expression in the glass for several minutes. She was not certain she had achieved it. She had not anticipated that it would be difficult to look through James Wentworth, Viscount Hallerton. He was difficult to look through for several reasons, most of them physical. He occupied space differently from the other men in the house, not because he was louder or more assertive, but because he was more contained, and the containment had a weight to it, a density, as if he were deliberately taking up slightly less room than he could, and this restraint cost him something. He did not move through Lord Pemberton's drawing room the way the other guests moved, freely and carelessly, using the space as a room that was owed to them. He moved through it with a kind of deliberate selection, going to the window, to the writing table, to the door, and never anywhere that she could identify as purposeless. She watched him over the course of the first evening, in the way that she watched Fenwick and Lady Maud, and the arrangement of the room, and the position of the back stairs. She watched him as a piece of information, as context, as something that would matter to understand. On the second morning she was in the east corridor with a basket of fresh tapers, when she heard a sound from the blue sitting room and went still. It was a child, crying, or nearly, the kind of sound that is very carefully being restrained, and she pushed the door open before she remembered that she was a maid, and maids push doors open all the time. It was entirely natural. And inside the blue sitting room she found Miss Dorothea Vale sitting perfectly straight in a chair by the window, with her hands folded in her lap, and her eyes very bright. "I beg your pardon, miss," Cecily said. Dorothea looked at her with the expressionless calm of a young woman who has been trained to be expressionless in front of servants. "You need not beg it," she said. "I am perfectly well." She was not perfectly well, which was evident, but Cecily had been trained not to notice what she was not meant to notice, and she backed out of the room and closed the door quietly, and stood in the corridor for a moment, and she thought about that. Lady Maud's chosen candidate for Lord Hallerton's attentions, the correct match, the diamond of this particular small season, positioned with care and purpose at every gathering, every dinner, every arranged walk on the grounds. And she had been sitting by the window alone on the second morning of the party, with her hands folded in her lap, and something behind her eyes that she was working very hard to contain, and no one had been there to notice it but a baronet's daughter in a borrowed apron. That afternoon, carrying a tray of teacups down the main corridor toward the back passage, Cecily came around the corner, and found Lord Hallerton coming in the opposite direction. He was moving quickly, not carelessly, absorbed in something she could not see, and there was a single moment where the tray, and the corridor, and the corner all converged at the wrong time, and the tray tilted. He caught it. He caught it with both hands, his hands outside hers, on the handles, the cups rattling against one another but not breaking, the cloth on the tray sliding, but the tray itself held steady. They were very close together, both holding the tray, and his face was approximately 6 inches from her face. He looked at her. She looked at the tray. "Forgive me," he said. She said, "My fault entirely, my lord," in the voice she had been practicing, the one that belonged to a maid. And she settled the cloth back into place, and took the tray from his hands, and stepped around him in the corridor, and did not look back. She carried the tray all the way to the back passage before she set it down on the shelf there, and stood for a moment, with her hands flat on the wood, composing herself. He had caught it very quickly. He had not thought about it. He had simply put his hands out and held the thing level, with the reflexes of a man who has been taught that you keep hold of what you are responsible for, and then he had apologized to a maid for being in a corridor. She picked up the tray and continued. That evening, she was refilling a water carafe near the fireplace at the far end of the drawing room when Lord Hallerton appeared at her elbow and said quietly, "Move back from the grate." She turned. The grate was throwing sparks in a way that the fire guard was not quite catching, and the hem of the gray dress was closer to it than she had realized. She stepped back. He watched until she was at a safe distance, then returned to the window without a word. She stood with the carafe and looked at the space where he had been, and allowed herself privately a single thought on the subject, which was that she understood now why Dorothea Vale might sit by a window with her hands folded and her eyes very bright. In the withdrawing room before dinner, she was refilling a water carafe when she heard Lady Maud's voice, pitched for Miss Vale's ears alone. Or, very nearly alone. Dorothea was 22, and polished in the manner of a woman who has been prepared for the season since she was old enough to walk her broom correctly, her white gown impeccable, an ice blue sash at her waist, a strand of her mother's pearls at her throat. She was the correct choice, and she knew it, and the knowledge sat on her like a crown that had never quite been lifted off. "The Ashmore creature has no place at this table," Lady Maud said. "Whatever her father once was." She did not lower her voice sufficiently. The carafe was heavy in Cecily's hand. She did not look up. Through them, Nell had said. She looked through Lady Maud, and through Dorothea, and through the pale silk chair, and out the window, into the darkness of the Pemberton grounds, and she moved on. Dinner was long, and the courses were many. And the conversation moved across the table in the way conversation moves at these gatherings, everyone speaking to everyone else through the medium of established social positions, as if the words were less important than the geometry of who addressed whom with what degree of warmth. Cecily circled the table with the other servants, keeping her eyes on the plates and the glasses and the level of the wine, and when she passed behind Lord Hallerton's chair, she was close enough to catch the scent of wool and cedar that the cold air had carried in from his coat. She was refilling a glass near the middle of the table, when Lady Maud said, to no one in particular, her voice carrying cleanly in one of the pauses that sometimes overtake a table of 14, "I confess I had not realized the Ashmores were still received in good company. One does hear things." There was a short pause. Cecily kept the decanter steady. Her hand was perfectly still. She was aware of Lord Hallerton's posture without looking at him directly, aware of a slight shift, a stillness slightly different from the stillness of a moment ago. "One hears many things," Lord Pemberton said pleasantly, as a host does covering the moment. "The season is prodigious in that respect." Dinner continued. Cecily moved on. It was on the second afternoon that she found what she had come for. She had been given the assignment of the East Corridor because one of the house's regular maids had twisted her ankle on the back stairs, and Lord Pemberton's housekeeper, a competent woman named Mrs. Ray Croft, had redistributed the afternoon duties without much ceremony. Cecily had been given a basket of fresh tapers and a list of the rooms that needed them restocked, and she had moved through the East Corridor with the basket over her arm, and her senses attentive to everything: the placement of doors, the sounds through walls, the small signs of which rooms were occupied, and which were not. She heard Fenwick's voice before she saw him. He was in the small anteroom at the end of the corridor, the one that connected the east wing to the library, and the door was not quite closed. She did not stop walking. She set down the basket outside the anteroom, as if she had reached her next room, and she stood with her back to the wall beside the door, and she listened. A second voice, lower and unfamiliar, an arrangement being confirmed. "A packet of letters," the man said. "The complete set, not the excerpts." There was a figure named. It was not a small figure. The exchange, the second voice said, would take place in the library tonight, when the rest of the company was at cards. Then Fenwick's voice again, satisfied and soft. "The Ashmore nobody will never find what she is looking for," he said. "She has no standing to look." Cecily picked up her basket. She walked back down the East Corridor, at the measured pace of a woman who is thinking about tapers. Her father's ring was steady against her breastbone. Her mind was steady, or nearly so. She had the information she needed. She had, she realized, approximately 6 hours. If you have been listening closely and find yourself with your breath held, know that so was she. Leave a thought in the comments if you have stayed with her this far. She returned to the evening's work. She carried things and set them down and moved through rooms that paid her no more attention than they paid the furniture. And all the while she was calculating the geometry of the library and the timing of the card game and whether Sir Edward Groves, the magistrate she had identified among the guests on her first evening, would be persuaded to remain awake past 10 o'clock if she sent him a note in the next 2 hours. She could not send a note. She was a maid. Maids did not send notes to magistrates. There was a back staircase from the servants' corridor to the library landing. She knew it. Mrs. Croft had shown it to her on the first morning, explaining that the library fire needed to be maintained through the evening regardless of the card game, and that one of the girls would need to do it quietly without disturbing the gentleman. She had volunteered. Mrs. Croft had looked at her and nodded and returned to her inventory. The library at Thornfield Park was 2 stories, the shelves floor to ceiling, a rolling ladder on a brass rail, a fireplace with a carved marble surround at the room's west end, and a writing table positioned between 2 tall windows at the east. That afternoon, when she had come to lay the fire for the evening, she had found Lord Hallerton there. He was alone. He was sitting at the writing table, not writing, holding a folded letter that he had not opened. The letter was addressed to someone in a hand. She could see from across the room was his own, and it had not been sent, because the seal was still intact, and the addressee's name was written at the top, in the way one writes a name when one still hopes, even now, that some conveyance might be found for it. She had come in quietly, because she had been trained to come in quietly. She knelt at the grate and began to lay the fire. She was not certain. He knew she was there. He was very still, the letter in both hands, looking at it the way a man looks at a thing he has decided he cannot put down and cannot open. Some things, he said very quietly, not to her, not to the room exactly, cannot be corrected after the fact. She did not respond. She was a maid. She was not there. She fed a new log into the grate, and adjusted the damper, and stood and took her basket, and moved toward the door, and she was at the door when she glanced back and found him looking at her. He was not looking at a maid. He was not looking through her. He was looking at something he had not expected to see in a library at 4 p.m. And she did not know what he saw, but she felt the look the way you feel, a sudden warmth from a fire that is just caught. She left. That evening, she was at the grate, again at 9:30, feeding it, keeping it low so the light would not reach into the main body of the library, where the shelves were. She heard the back door of the library open at 10:20. Fenwick entered, crossed to the writing table, and set a small leather case on its surface. A moment later the second door, the one from the main corridor, opened, and the second man entered. He was unknown to her. He wore a decent coat, and carried himself with the manner of a man employed to do things that his employer prefers not to do directly. She had one letter, the fragment she had found in the anteroom which Fenwick had let fall carelessly while confirming the arrangement. She had palmed it then, and carried it pressed against her palm for the remainder of the afternoon and the whole of the evening, and she held it, now crouched beside the grate in the shadow of the chimney-piece. She could not take the case. She did not know what was in the case, and she could not open it without revealing herself. She had one fragment and her own testimony, and neither was enough, and she knew it. Fenwick was doing the same calculation. She saw it on his face when he turned from the second man and found her there, standing, the fragment in her hand. He did not shout. He was not the kind of man who shouts. He crossed to her in 4 steps, and he looked at her with the eyes of a man who has been doing this kind of work for 15 years, and is not frightened of a baronet's daughter who has no standing. "You're a long way from your drawing-room, Miss Ashmore," he said. She held the fragment out. "This is my father's hand," she said, "and your annotation in the margin." He looked at the letter, and then at her, and then back at the letter. And then he smiled, the smile of a man who has reviewed the board and found his position sound. "You came here in a servant's dress," he said, "under a false name. You have been moving through this house under false pretenses. Whatever you think you have found, whatever you think you can say to these people, you will say it as a woman who deceived Lord Pemberton's household. Your reputation, Miss Ashmore, is what remains of your family. You do not have much of it. I advise you to consider that carefully before you take another step." He took the fragment from her hand. She let him take it. He folded it into the case with the rest of the letters, and he gave her one last look, measured and final, and he left. The second man left. The library was empty. The fire was low. She was alone and cold, and the calculation she had been holding together for 3 weeks had just failed her. She stood at the grate for what felt like a long time. The ring on its ribbon was warm from her skin. She reached up and held it in her closed fist through the gray wool through the apron, and she thought about her father sitting at his own desk in his own house and the letter he had been holding when he died. She thought about the library corridor at Thornfield Park and the way Lord Hallerton had looked at a sealed letter, addressed in his own hand to a man who could no longer receive it. Some things cannot be corrected after the fact. That was true. It was true. It did not mean you did not try. she went to find Nell. She was in the cream gown and the sage-green Spencer jacket. In less than 15 minutes, her dark hair pinned as it ought to be pinned, the mob cap gone, the apron gone, the gray dress folded over Nell's arm, the signet ring still on its ribbon but held in her closed hand now because she did not yet have the right to wear it openly. Nell did not say anything. She smoothed the back of the Spencer with practiced hands, and nodded and stepped aside. The drawing room at Thornfield Park was occupied by 12 people, it being past 11, and the card game having given way to conversation and a final glass before bed. Lord Pemberton was near the fire. Sir Edward Groves was in the chair nearest the door, which was fortunate, because he was the first person to see her. She walked to the center of the room. The conversation slowed, then stopped. She had expected this and had decided somewhere in the 15 minutes she had been dressing that she had no use for the flutter of embarrassment it might otherwise have produced. She looked at Sir Edward. "Sir Edward," she said, "I have a matter requiring your attention. I apologize for the hour." She was aware of the room reconstituting itself around this sentence. She was aware of Lady Maud's attention sharpening the fan. Stilling in her lap, she was aware of Fenwick standing near the door to the east corridor, his florid face shifting toward the color of old wax. She was aware of Lord Hallerton, standing at the far window, who had turned. She produced the copy she had made. She had made it on the night she first found the altered letter, on the back of a household account page in her own hand. She had carried it in the bottom of her traveling bag under a pair of gloves. She laid it on the low table before Sir Edward, and she spoke. She spoke her father's name. She named the correspondence, the faction it had been intended to implicate, the selective removal of context that transformed a private letter about agricultural policy into the appearance of partisan conspiracy. She named Fenwick. She named the leather case. She had watched him place on the writing table in the library, not 40 minutes ago, in the presence of a man she could not identify but whose presence she could attest to. She was precise, and she was brief, and her voice did not shake because her voice had decided not to shake, and she was grateful to it for this. Lady Maud said, "This is a most improper intrusion." Her voice had the quality of very cold water. "A woman arrives at this hour in circumstances that are themselves highly irregular, having entered this house under false pretenses, and expects to be received as a credible witness. My dear Lord Pemberton, surely you can see what this is. What this is," Lord Pemberton said carefully, "is an accusation against a man who is my guest, made by a woman who is the daughter of a man I knew. I will hear it out." "She is no one," Lady Maud said. "The Ashmores are finished. Whatever she claims her father wrote, her father is dead, and his debts are not. She is a girl with nothing. And whatever she has done to get herself into this room tonight, she has done it without any sanction whatever." A figure moved at the edge of the room. It was not Sir Edward. Sir Edward was already at the writing desk, producing his notebook, looking at the copy she had laid before him, with the careful attention of a man who was doing the work his position requires. The figure who moved was Lord Hallerton. He crossed the room in 3 strides. He did not cross it quickly, and he did not cross it slowly. He crossed it with the particular deliberateness of a man who has made a decision and is not inclined to revisit it. And he came to stand 2 paces from Cecily and turned to face the room. "Miss Ashmore is under my protection," he said. "I will hear no more." It was 12 words, or very nearly. It was not 12 words of poetry. It was 12 words of procedural commitment, spoken in a voice that did not rise, and the room understood them perfectly. Lady Maud's fan did not quite close. It stilled. Fenwick made a sound that was not quite speech, and was not quite silence. Sir Edward looked up from his notebook. "The leather case," he said to the room at large, "is in the library. I will want it retrieved. Lord Hallerton, I wonder if you might accompany me." Lord Hallerton said, "Of course." He had not looked at Cecily directly, since crossing the room. He had stood beside her and faced the assembled company, and that had been enough, and she understood it was enough, and something in her chest that had been rigid for 11 months and 3 days and 15 minutes shifted the smallest fraction, like a door that has been warped by winter and has now been persuaded to move. In the library, with Sir Edward and 2 footmen, and Lord Pemberton, the leather case was on the writing table where Fenwick had left it, because there are certain men who do not, in the end, run. The case was opened and examined, and Sir Edward noted the documents inside, and then Lord Hallerton said something that Cecily had not expected. He said he had seen handwriting of this type before. Not the letters themselves, those were clearly the Ashmore correspondence, but the annotations in the margins. The small insertions of date and emphasis and framing. He said he had seen this particular style of marginal annotation in documents that had been submitted in his father's affairs 2 years ago, in circumstances that had never been satisfactorily explained. He said it quietly, his voice level, in the manner of a man who has been holding a piece of information for 2 years and has now found the place it was meant to go. Sir Edward's notebook received all of this. Fenwick was asked, with great procedural courtesy, to remain at Thornfield Park for the present. Lady Maud did not remain. Lady Maud departed the following morning at an hour that required her servants to be woken before the household was properly awake, and Miss Vale departed with her. The ice-blue sash folded carefully inside her trunk. Cecily did not watch them leave. She was in the breakfast room eating the first meal she had eaten without a tray. In 3 days, and Nell was across the table from her, with a cup of tea and an expression of considerable satisfaction. It had begun to snow by the time the carriages went. She had found over the course of the morning that she did not know quite what to do with herself. She had been planning this for 3 weeks, and now the plan had concluded, and Sir Edward had her copy, and the original letters and Fenwick's attestation, and she was wearing her own clothes and sitting in a room where people addressed her by her name. And she felt as if she had been running at a considerable pace, and had now come to a very sudden stop, and was not certain what to do with the momentum. She put on her cloak after breakfast and went into the garden. The snow was light, not yet settling on the gravel, drifting rather than falling. The sky the particular pewter of a November morning in England, when the weather is not yet committed to anything. She walked to the end of the rose arbor and back, and then stood at the edge of the garden path looking at the gray lawns, and she held her father's signet ring in her gloved hand. She had not put it on her finger. She did not know, precisely, why she had not. She heard the crunch of boots on the gravel. She knew, before she turned, that it was Lord Hallerton. He came to stand beside her at the edge of the path. He was in his greatcoat, which was dark and heavy, and had been put on with some haste, she thought. He looked at the snow for a moment. "Sir Edward tells me," he said, "that the case is conclusive. The annotations are in a hand that can be traced. He believes your father's correspondence can be fully restored to its proper context," she said. "I am glad to hear it." He said, "I owe you an apology." She turned to look at him. His profile was very still, jaw set, eyes on the gray lawn. "In the library," he said, "the first afternoon when you brought the candles. I looked at you and saw nothing of interest." He paused. "It was not among my more accurate observations." She did not quite smile. She was working on it. "You were not meant to see anything," she said. "I had taken some care with that." Nevertheless. He turned. He was looking at her now with the eyes that were not looking through her. Had not been looking through her since the afternoon by the grate, and she looked back, because there was nothing else to do, and nowhere else she particularly wanted to look. "The letter on the desk," she said. "Yesterday afternoon. I should not have been in the room." He was quiet for a moment. "It was a letter I wrote to my father after a certain matter had become clear to me. A letter explaining what had happened and how it had happened, and that I had not done what he believed I had done." He paused again. "He died before I could send it. A man I trusted had shown him certain correspondence of mine, removed from its context, in order to achieve an end that served that man, and cost my father the last peace he might have had." The snow fell between them very quietly. She opened her hand. The signet ring lay on her palm, the small crest worn smooth by her father's years of use, and then by her own months of keeping. "He was careful about his words," she said. He was precise. He was not what they said he was. "I know," Lord Hallerton said. "I read the letters this morning with Sir Edward. The whole correspondence restored. Your father was a man who was worth knowing." She closed her hand around the ring. She would put it on her finger. Now, she decided. She had done what she had come to do. She worked the ribbon loose with her fingers, slid the ring free, and placed it on the finger where it belonged. Lord Hallerton watched this. He said nothing. "Last night," she said, "when you crossed the room, I want you to know that I was not expecting it." "Nor was I," he said, quite. He offered her his arm then because the snow was beginning to settle, and the path was not well gravel, and she took it because her shoes were not entirely adequate for the conditions, and she was not Nell, who had spent 3 years learning to navigate the back stairs at Thornfield Park. They walked back toward the house along the edge of the rose arbor, the snow coming down around them in the particular quiet way of early winter snow, and inside the breakfast room Nell was still at the table, she supposed with her cup of tea, and the fire was still going, and her father's name was beginning, somewhere in Sir Edward's careful notebook, to be put back together again. The ring was warm on her finger. She did not let go of his arm. If Cecily's courage moved you, leave a word below. There is always something to be said for the woman who dresses for the work that needs doing and walks into the room anyway. The snow kept falling. The roses in the arbor were bare, but they had thorns still, which meant they were alive. And in the spring they would be something else altogether. And neither of them would be quite who they had been when the week began. And that, she thought, was not the worst thing in the world.